Okay, just so you're aware, we're live now, but I will start in about a minute, just giving people a chance to join. Okay, welcome to all the attendees. I see we have a growing number. We're going to start at 1 minute past 9, so just bear with us. We're just giving people a chance to join the session. Okay, great. So good afternoon, good morning, or good night, depending on where you are in the world. It's really great to have you join us for this webinar. My name is Ekoswehi Yahen, and I'm the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum, which is a public-private partnership led by the insurance industry, but also supported by international organizations, including the World Bank and the United Nations. For those of you who are less familiar with the IDF, our aim is to optimize and extend the use of insurance and related risk management capabilities to build greater resilience and protection for people, communities, businesses, public institutions that are vulnerable to disasters and their associated economic shocks. This webinar forms part of a series of convenings organized by the IDF to really shed light into pressing topics and issues within the broader insurance development, climate change, disaster risk management, and finance and resilience landscape. It's quite broad, but we try to convene these events to give people an opportunity to exchange both from the public and the private sector around themes around these things. This webinar in particular builds on an important report which we launched a little over a month ago on the development impact of risk analytics. But before we get into the report, I always think it's useful to get a sense of what the audience thinks about the topic. And so we've pulled together just one question as part of a poll to get us thinking, especially for those of us who are about to go to bed or those of us who are just waking up to start thinking about the topic. So I'll ask my colleague, Rebecca, if she can pull up the poll question. And basically it is, what do you think is the most important contribution of risk analysis to sustainable development? Can you see the question? Just to confirm if you can see the question. We have a number of options for you to choose from. The first, is it to provide a strategic view for setting development priorities? Is it to assist with pricing risk for green investment and residual risk transfer? Or to build a shared language of risk for cross-sector collaboration? And I have to say there is a wrong and right answer, by the way. That's a joke. But just to get a sense of what the audience is thinking in relation to the topic. So can you see the poll?
I don't think we see the poll, Ekoswehi.
Okay, I don't think we see the poll. Okay, so let's give it a few seconds to come up. But while we're waiting for the poll to come up, I can give you a little bit of context to the discussion that we are having here today. The IDF paper itself was really conceived out of, I think, something that most of us feel, which is urgency around the fact that we keep seeing these catastrophic events, these disasters occurring. And despite all the information that we have out there, we are still not seeing the kind of improvements that we need to see across various countries, governments, communities, in terms of better managing their risk. So there's a sense of urgency, I believe, that we all feel, if it's from COVID-19, but also witnessing the impacts of disasters right across the globe, in terms of how can we do better in terms of leveraging information so that people can actually use that information to make better decisions. And so this is what has really driven the development of this report. But I see that the poll is now up. So unfortunately, the panelists can't vote, so you're excluded. But others, please feel free to pick one, make a choice in terms of the three options. And once you voted, then I will provide some reflections on the responses that I see. But going back to my what I had started to share with you was that, so for us within the IDF, there's definitely an urgency in terms of how can we support the availability of better risk information, better risk insights, so that we can actually see tangible improvements in the resilience of countries, communities, and how governments, et cetera, are using information to support this agenda. But it also comes against a backdrop where in 2019, during the United Nations Secretary General's Climate Action Summit, we noticed a marked shift in terms of the policy dialogue, where equal priority was given to risk reduction and resilience, and not only mitigation. There was also a focus continued to move towards ex-ante preventative investments in preference to ex-post emergency response. And there was also an increasing value attached to public and private sector collaboration, both at the strategic and operational level. And so for us within the IDF community, there was a compelling case in terms of developing this report to drive the discussion, but importantly also action around this. And so our process involved consultation with a variety of institutions, both from the public and the private sector, humanitarian community, the academic community, to frame this report and how we should approach it, but what are some of the key recommendations and things that we should be thinking about. And what we found was a great enthusiasm from the community around this effort, a willingness to contribute. But there was also a basic set of principles that I think we all corralled around, which was that risk understanding and capability should be a capability available to risk owners and their agencies, that a set of open technologies and standards and principles are already available to make rapid spread of risk understanding possible, and that women, girls, and vulnerable groups should be discernible in the analysis and indeed should be involved in the process of understanding risk. So these were some of the things that emerged from the work that we did. So our session today is really geared towards elaborating on the report and its recommendations, on what we see as the potential solutions, and offering an opportunity for reflections and discussion amongst leading thinkers and doers on this topic. And so with that, we have a fantastic lineup. And I'm really grateful to have here during this webinar with us, Mami Mizutori, who is the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction based in Geneva, Switzerland. We also have, so thank you, Mami. It's really an honor to have you on here during this webinar and to share your perspectives. We also have Eric Andersen, who is the president of Aeon and has served in a number of important leadership positions throughout his 20 years career at Aeon, most recently as Chief Executive Officer of Aeon Benfield, and prior to that was Chief Executive Officer of Aeon Risk Solutions Americas. So really lending a voice from the private sector to the discussion that we're going to be having here today. So thank you, Aeon, really delighted to have you here. In addition to that, we also have Daniel Clarke, who is the Director for the Center for Disaster Protection, which is established by the UK government to support countries and international systems to better manage risks and moving away from reaction to readiness, and based on the belief that disasters should not be surprises. I would highly recommend Daniel's book, Dull Disasters, which he co-authored with Professor Stefan Derkon, the chief economist for DFID. which I think is a very timely book for all of us to read at this point in time. So thank you, Daniel, as well, for being on the line. And then importantly, we also have two forces, Ian Brannigan, who is the Chief Risk Officer for Renaissance Re and also the co-chair of the IDF Risk Modeling Steering Group. And I think for hopefully many of you on the line know Ian and how passionate he is about this topic, but also really a great mind when we talk about risk. So thank you, Ian. And then finally, also Nick Moody, who again has been a real force behind getting this report and really corralling input from a diverse variety of communities around this topic. So that's really our lineup in terms of speakers, and I hope that that gives you a clear sense of the importance of the voices that we have here to provide their perspectives. I see now that we have the poll is up and voting is in. We have the most votes. People feel that the importance of risk analysis is really to provide a strategic view of setting development priorities. Second most being price risk for green investment. Building a shared language of risk for cross-sector collaboration. And then finally, pricing risk for green investments and residual risk transfer. Okay, so there's a split between the first and the third option. I think that this in itself gives us a good insight into our audience, which is that obviously see application in terms of broader development work, but also the importance in terms of driving consensus around understanding risk and collaboration. So that's really, I think, quite insightful in terms of where people think the importance of how people think about the importance of this work. But I think it also highlights, obviously, the complexity of what we are trying to do here. So really thank you for that feedback. So great. So just to set some ground rules in terms of structure for the call, I will hand over shortly to Ian to provide us with some reflections. And then after that, open up for Nick Moody, who would give us some highlights in terms of the key recommendations from the report. After that, we will get keynotes from our three speakers before we go into a discussion with the speakers and then a question and answer. So that's really the running order. I'll encourage you to please put your questions into the chat box so we can draw on this towards the end of the discussion. And we also have in the chat box the links to the reports for those of you who might not have reviewed it yet. And so with that, I'll hand over to Ian, please, for your thoughts to kick us off.
Thanks, X-Ray. Thanks, everybody, for joining the call. I appreciate it very much. The IDF was really born out of the Sendai Agreement, 2015. It's important to note that the first priority of the Sendai Agreement was the understanding of disaster risk. And likewise, no accident that the underpinning of the work of the IDF is the same under the guise of the Risk Modeling Steering Group. Much has evolved in 5 years since Sendai. Discussion of protection gap has broadened into the discussion really of a resilience gap, which encompasses humanitarian, physical, and economic resilience more broadly. A predominant cause of the resilience gap that we often talk about now is poor or non-existent understanding and representation of the risks posed by natural disasters, particularly in the context of our changing climate. So in fact, the gap most often underestimated, under-resourced, is the lack of quality, fit for purpose, and easily accessible information about hazard, exposure, and risk. Importantly, often missing is the availability of this information before events happen to enable strategic resilience planning as opposed to just disaster response. This crucial gap is something that we call the risk insight gap. The Risk Modeling Steering Group of the IDF set out 5 years ago to develop a strategy that the public and private sector could take on and follow and collaborate towards closing this risk insight gap, enabling a shift from post-event disaster response to ex-ante disaster risk management and planning. The strategy was published and ratified in early 2019 and focused really on three of these key proposals. The first was industry-funded delivery and promotion of an open source and available to all risk modeling platform and tools and support. And secondly, that a public and privately funded modeling data content creation and curation entity be created in order as a resource to those in need and to facilitate local capability building. This hasn't been a theoretical exercise. Real work, real deliverables are being produced via a set of cross-industry and cross-industry public sector collaborations. The DERA paper that's being discussed today was produced by individuals and entities from both the public and private sectors involved in and around the RMSG. And it really serves as a science and evidence-based rallying cry to the public sector to support this strategy and to promote further collaboration between the public and private sectors. The idea revolves around moving the focus and capabilities of those at risk and their advisors and supporters to adopt a strategic program of risk model, risk data, and risk insight creation to enable ex-ante risk planning and resilience building. So thanks once again for the participants today. It's an honor to have them on board, and with that, I'll hand over to Nick.
Thanks, Ian. Rebecca, could I have slide 3, please? Good day to everybody, and thanks to Hakasway and to Ian for your opening comments. So this report is the result of, as you've heard, a collaboration of 30 organisations across public, private, development and humanitarian sectors, all sharing the view that risk understanding should not be the privilege of the few. And I have to say that going around those organisations as we were putting this report together, regardless of sector, it was like everybody had this this view inside and they just wanted to get it out there. It was a very easy sell to bring together this report. The paper points to paradoxes in the current system. For example, that investment in risk insight is largely concentrated in the global north. But the greatest risks, as we all know, and the greatest human vulnerabilities are in the global south. And also that while we all make big pronouncements and we all encourage systemic views of risk, in practice, the system is drip feeding single hazard, single project metrics without any real transfer of risk insight to where it's needed the most. So the paper is a highly evidenced look at the successes and also pitfalls of risk analytics to support decision-making in 3 areas: in risk prevention, residual risk transfer, and in humanitarian anticipatory action. It shines a light on the challenges of building sovereign capacity in risk analytics and how this can actually be achieved, but in partnership. And it devotes a chapter, as you heard from Ekosei, about the necessity of disaggregated data approaches that enable gender-specific action and the involvement of women and vulnerable groups in the process. The paper describes what an open modelling ecosystem could look like that would enable a shared view of risk across sectors. It shows how the private sector can contribute to making this happen, providing a gateway to collaborative risk management and to risk finance transactions. Could I have the next slide, please? So the paper, as you can see, makes 7 recommendations, and they're really quite detailed. They can't really be done justice here, but I'm going to pick out 3 of them in particular here. So if you look at the second one, for example, the paper encourages implementation of programs to empower sovereign risk owners by growing risk analytics capacity and integrating, crucially, local risk knowledge and understanding in the analysis, both quantitative and qualitative. And a strong reason for doing that is because we've discovered that that's a big factor in model acceptability to local stakeholders. Secondly, I would say one of the strongest recommendations is around bringing private sector expertise and resources into the mix. There's a huge gap between the resources available and what is needed to achieve the 2030 global agenda, and the private sector is a big part of the answer to that. I think you'll hear more of that during this webinar. And thirdly, the adoption of open risk modelling platforms, principles, and open data standards. You've heard something about that from Ian already. We think that a significant way of doing this would be adjustment of public sector procurement processes to encourage these principles. In doing so, you create choice, you reduce uncertainty, and you create a greater shared view of risk. Next slide, please, Rebecca. So the development impact of risk analytics was not just a paper, it's not a single event, it's a campaign. And as we build up to COP26, the IDF is making 3 calls to action around this. And these are, as you already heard, around the accelerated adoption of open risk platforms, principles, and standards, but also the creation of a strategic fund on which countries can bid in order to get international help from all sectors in building their risk analytics functions and their risk understanding. And the third call to action is the creation of a public-private entity, which would be the delivery vehicle for the delivery of this whole package, both on the technology side and on the model and data content and capacity building side. No one of these 3 elements works on its own, but you put the 3 of them together and it's a pretty powerful package. So finally, I would really encourage you to follow the link and read through the report, look at the recommendations, but also the logic and the theory of change couched in development and humanitarian terms that builds up to the recommendations. The report does have plenty of nice pictures, but I would say more importantly, it should be taken seriously because it is the shared view of 30 organizations from across all sectors on how we can democratize risk understanding, not just for the benefit of those sectors, but also for communities worldwide. Thank you. Ekoswehi, back to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that oversight into some of the recommendations from the report. I will now like to ask Mami to provide her reflections, which I think would be really welcome at this point in time, and given perspectives from the UNDRR on this issue. Thank you, Mami.
Thank you, Ekosway, and from me, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And it's really encouraging personally and as the representative of my organization, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, that there's a very high level of interest in the topic that we are dealing with today. I'd like to offer my very sincere thanks to all of the members of the IDF Risk Modeling Steering Group, co-chairs Ian Brannigan and Mark Gordon, and of course, Nick, for your excellent work in developing this important report, which, as you say, Nick, is not a piece of paper, it's a campaign. And we need a campaign, and we need it now. And I must say that timing is everything. And sadly, I think this report is coming at a time when we know that this kind of thinking is becoming more and more important, because the world is struggling on multiple fronts to cope with both the pandemic and the climate emergency attacking us at the same time. As Nick said, many of us still think in a single hazard mentality, but if you just think about a country being attacked by a cyclone when fighting COVID, we know that we live in a multi-hazard world. And the fact that we have managed to allow us to come where we are, that disaster risk is thriving, this is reason enough to question why our understanding of disaster risk has been overtaken by so many events. Events which honestly I think could have been prevented, or at the least the impact greatly mitigated, if we had understood the risks surrounding us better and listened to the early warnings and acted earlier. And it is difficult not to conclude that managing disaster is still the preferred default option, as Ian was saying, responding to disaster. And I must say, unfortunately, it is still the preferred default option of many politicians who, many of them cannot think outside the box of their election cycle, and they cannot really think about managing the disaster risk, acting before the disaster hits their people. And this is exactly what the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was adopted 5 years ago, said. Let us move away from trying to manage disaster. We need to manage disaster risk. And let's hope that we have their attention, the politicians' attention now, decision makers, maybe not only politicians, but decision makers everywhere, because there has to be a greater understanding of the systemic nature of disaster risk as we see COVID-19, first a public health crisis, rapidly becoming a socioeconomic crisis and upending every aspect of our lives, not only health, but education, trade, transportation, and social safety nets. So it is not, I don't think anybody can doubt that we're in an era where weak risk governance can no longer be tolerated. And this is what COVID-19 has taught us again, that countries which have managed to have a better risk governance have somewhat getting out of this better. And the fact is that there are so many risks drivers, including, of course, climate change, biological hazards, poverty, environmental destruction, rapid urbanization. And this is why, again, we cannot think about a single risk or a single hazard. And this is actually what was outlined in UNDRR's 2019 Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction. The point was that we need to understand the systemic nature of risk that surrounds us and their cascading impacts. An analysis that is informed by the power of quantitative and qualitative approaches to understanding risk is therefore becoming more and more important than ever. And we know that the achievement of the Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement, and of course the Sendai Framework itself is contingent upon our ability to really understand the risk that surrounds us and make decisions which are risk-informed, that has the right risk insight, allowing us to take effective pathways to resilience to be determined with confidence. Risk analytics can support the development and strengthening of national and local strategies for disaster risk reduction, and also what is called the national adaptation plans. And there's a lot of overlap between the two. And by the way, member states of the United Nations need to have both of these, the strategies for disaster risk reduction and the national adaptation plans, by the end of this year. And innovative collaboration that bridges sectors and domains such as the IDF is truly essential, as are increased efforts to invest resources at scale to support this kind of transition that has been called upon but has not happened yet. This report, as Nick just mentioned, has 7 very important concrete recommendations. They are all very important, but I think that the recommendation to create a strategic fund to support efforts at the national level to develop risk analytics functionality on a sustainable basis is very important. The recommendation to create, and this is what Nick also said is important, public-private entity and or programs to deliver the capacity building aspect of this fund, including provision for sustainable risk education and communication programs, is very important. We need to be educated. We need to have the right risk information to have the best insight. And finally, I also think that the recommendation about the accelerated adoption of open risk modeling platforms, principles, and standards is truly important. Of course, I'm not trying to say that the others are not, but I would pick these 3 if I were asked, what do you think are the most important recommendation? And this report also demonstrates that the central importance of risk analytics to the task of achieving sustainable development goals, including eradication of poverty and hunger, creating sustainable cities and communities, and action on climate. We need to achieve the sustainable development goals by 2030, but we also know that nothing really undermines sustainable development and erodes the gains of development like disasters. So again, if we cannot achieve the Sendai framework, understand the risk that's surrounding us, we cannot achieve the SDGs. And I will conclude by saying that really timing is everything, and we cannot fail to seize this moment when COVID-19 is showing us, telling us, each of us, that the risk is around us and we need to react. And the other thing is that there will be vaccines for COVID-19, but there will not be vaccines for climate emergency. We cannot isolate ourselves from climate emergency. So yes, as Nick said, towards COP26 to really build this campaign, get it moving forward is crucial for ourselves to not run into the existential risk of humanity. So thank you very much again for this excellent report, and I really look forward to today's discussion. Over to you, Ekosue.
Thank you very much, Mami, for that excellent overview in terms of the global policy context that we're dealing with, but also the challenges as well, and highlighting the key recommendations that you found within the report. I also thought it was a fantastic segue to Eric Andersen in terms of some perspectives from the private sector, because this is, again, as Mami had highlighted, not something that's in the domain of a singular institution. So over to you, Eric, for some reflections given your role within Aon and also the broader IDF community.
Thanks, Ekeswe, and really congratulations to the IDF colleagues for getting the report completed and starting the campaign. We're really excited about it here at Aon because we know how important it is for the private sector to engage and what role the private sector can play in helping to overcome the challenges of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. You know, just as an example, recently, Hurricane Ida and Iota caused billions of dollars of damage in Central America, where the majority of the affected communities are largely uninsured. The early estimates have the losses somewhere around 2 billion, and the majority of it was flood and wind-related damage, which in the private market, there could potentially be solutions. You know, and this against, as Mami was saying and other speakers, against COVID-19 pandemic, which has just exacerbated the impact on the communities and the livelihoods of the people that are living in these locations. You know, the protection gap is too large to be met by the development and humanitarian sectors alone. The private sector has a critical role to play in bringing both resources and expertise to drive a meaningful and sustainable impact in these communities. And this is where firms like Aon and others like us can help. You know, we want to be able to help apply new approaches to provide innovative solutions that help address these challenges. But it starts with a better risk understanding and insight, as others shared earlier. Specifically, you know, at Aon, our job is essentially to match capital to risk. But in order to do so over the long term, capital providers need to understand what they're signing up for. We believe that the role of data and analytics has become increasingly important to unlock that capital and those broader sources of capital to help achieve our long-term goals. And it's not an easy issue to solve. The industry needs to create an approach that is sustainable to help to meet the 2030 goals. You know, ESG is becoming such an important area of focus, and it was mentioned before, in all the private sector boardrooms. And so now is the time to kind of capitalize on that momentum and move these things forward. And I know we are certainly making our own commitments at Aon, but it's why the work of the IDF framework is so important. It provides that rallying cry to move us all forward together. You know, a couple of the panelists mentioned this concept about understanding risk. Maybe if I could just offer a couple of comments on it. It really underpins everything. It's the basis where the sustainable goals of the report can be solved for. You know, many of us talk about this information gap, but really it's about finding scalable, resilient solutions that are based on a public-private partnership and create that shared language of risk across multiple sectors. As Mami pointed out in her foreword of the report, it's really about preventative investment to protect communities and close that protection gap in advance of needing reactionary emergency spending. But in our experience, it only works by forming partnerships. Building risk insight is a complex issue, and we need to combine all of our skills and experiences. And that's why we're committed to those partnerships and to provide open source technology such as OASIS and other modeling capabilities. You know, partnerships, whether they're forged through technical work, such as risk modeling or other IDF working groups, are fundamental if we want to build markets together and help society become more resilient. For many in the private sector, this is a new area. However, there is a strong willingness to listen and to engage and to learn. And as many of you may have seen during our Protection Gap conference in February, Aon and others were investing in programs to support resilience and economic development, to better understand how to bring scalable solutions that create lasting impact. And we're working with the IDF and the other partners because we feel now is the time for advocacy and action. Global shifts and new ways of working, especially in the middle of the pandemic, can also be a catalyst to get things going. And we're committed to moving forward and partnering to building scalable long-term solutions that build on analytics to address the protection gap now and into the future. So let me just close by saying thanks for the opportunity to be with everyone today. Congratulations again to the team for getting this very important report out into the public. And we really look forward to working with the IDF on these critical issues. So Ekeswe, back over to you.
Thanks, Eric. Really great comments. You mentioned a number of things that I think are really important, which is it's a new area for the private sector when we start talking about protection gap, especially in particularly vulnerable countries. But we also have, a lot of public sector institutions that are already actively engaged in discussions with governments around their risk. And so it's really about how do we bridge those conversations and drive real meaningful action on the ground. And again, I think this is a fantastic entry point to Daniel Clarke from the Center for Disaster Protection, who I hope is going to elaborate a little bit on, what does it mean on the ground, in particular vulnerable countries who have to deal with these disasters on such a frequent basis, and why thinking around risk analytics at this point is really, really very important. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Ekeswe. So first, I wanted to reiterate, I also found the IDF report to be uplifting, that so many experts and organizations came together with one voice to call for a change in the way countries and the international crisis finance system, the relationship it has with disaster risk information, and in fact, the relationship it has with disaster risks. And I see a strong parallel in the asks from this report. And in fact, a lot of what we see in disaster risk management more generally, what needs to happen with disaster risk information is similar to what needs to happen with the management of disaster risks, things like improving empowerment, improving openness. I particularly think that the international system needs to do much better on sustainability of investments in disaster risk information. Too often, it treats investing in disaster risk information as a one-off capital investment. You pay for a model and then you walk away. And actually, you need to think much more around sustainability, and particularly that sustainability in operating and maintaining risk information over time. Because ultimately, if risk insight goes out of date very quickly, then risk management will as well. So risk insight needs to stay up to date as things change. And I think it's a point well made. But I think as we call for the international system and countries to really change the way their relationship with disaster risk and future disasters, we can't ignore the way that disasters are currently paid for and managed. So Mami already mentioned the point that too often around the world, countries and indeed the international system treat disasters like surprises beforehand. They act as though it is somebody else's problem. The international system acts as though it's countries' problems, and national governments often act as though it is the responsibility fully of citizens and businesses. And they pretend it is somebody else's problem. And then a disaster strikes, and then you have governments will step in and support. You'll have the international system will step in and support. But this is too late. Take COVID as an example. So we've been tracking international financial flows for COVID, and only 2% of that finance for COVID was arranged in advance. And even less of that had been pre-arranged, linked to this kind of risk insight that is called for in the IDF report. With climate change, with rising food insecurity, with future disease threats, we need to do an awful lot better. It's not about the amount of money needed. It's about creating a more predictable, effective and accountable crisis finance system. And this is why, so Nick, you talked about what IDF will be campaigning for on the road to COP26. If you'll allow me, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the Centre for Disaster Protection will be campaigning for next year, a big year, obviously in the context of COVID, in the context of increasing recognition of the impact of climate change, and with these two big events, the G7 and COP26 next year. I'm pleased to say that one of our asks is in fact very similar to the ask in the IDF paper. So we're calling it a global crisis lookout function, which would help the world understand, prioritize and pay for the risks we face. But there would be two other asks as well. One would be agreeing a global target for crisis funding to be arranged ahead of disasters. And then also for the G7 to support an initial group of particularly vulnerable countries to really get going and fast track on improved crisis financing. So this isn't going to be easy. For those of you who've worked with the international system, you will know that it is resistant to change for good reason. But 2021 really offers an opportunity to fill the big gap that we currently have with the international system, not just supporting countries to develop crisis risk, but also looking in the mirror and doing its part and really using risk information to inform its decisions as well and walk its talk. That's why we're launching this new coalition for the G7 to campaign for G7 leaders and we'd love to work with you all on this agenda. If it's something your organisation would like to find out more about, please do get in contact. I'd also encourage you, obviously, to get into contact with Ekoswei, Nick, and the team at IDF. So we're working very closely together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So I heard your comment about risk function. That's at the heart of what we are trying to do within the IDF. You know, the work that the private sector, the insurance industry does, the work that Mami is leading through the UNDRR, etc. So I really hope that for those of us who are really tuned into this call, that we really galvanize and mobilize ourselves around this, which is, yes, based on the recognition that we know we need better risk information, we do have a series of recommendations that we can rally around to move this agenda forward. So that's really part of the call that we have. So really thanks for those three excellent interventions, and I think all bringing different perspectives to the discussions today. I picked up a number of things which I would like to follow up on. And this is really to Mami and also to Daniel. We've just talked about the importance of building risk function, and Daniel, you talked about sustainability and making sure that there's ownership within governments around this risk, around owning their risk. But what do you see as the major barriers and challenges when you start to engage with national governments around this issue? Because it seems like something that you should intuitively latch onto and move with. But what do you see individually as some of the challenges with this? And then also to Eric, I thought your comments in terms of the fact that the insurance industry and private sector is really taking on this this idea of how do we collaborate better with public sector institutions to drive meaningful solutions. But and how it's within the discussions around ESG, the profile is really increasing. But what do you really see as the barriers in terms of driving this agenda and collaborating with the public sector around this space? So those are some questions. And I would say Mami first, Daniel, and then Eric.
Thank you, Ekoswei. So what are the barriers? What are the challenges? A lot of the national governments still do not look as prevention as something that needs to be a policy across all their ministries, across all their sectors, and something that needs to happen before the disaster strikes. So what we see is that usually in many countries, there is a national disaster management agency which is dedicated to both response to disaster and prevention. And many times they just exhaust their rather meager resources in responding. And the other thing is that even when they look into disaster risk reduction prevention, they're looking at historic single hazard that has been most frequent. And they don't look into climate emergency, the future, what this means to themselves, even when climate emergency is already starting to attack them. And the other thing is that many countries still do not include the voice of all the stakeholders when they establish their policy for disaster risk reduction. They need to talk to the vulnerable people, and the vulnerable people should be empowered. They should be part of the process, but instead they're not really in there. So as we know, disaster is a combination of the hazard, the exposure and the vulnerability, but if the vulnerability part is really not included in the plan to begin with, then it's not going to work because as always, disaster will keep on impacting the most vulnerable people the most. So those, I think, are the things that we see time and again. But I do feel that this kind of wide private-public partnership is where we can start to really address these issues. Over to you.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Ekoswei. So I'd agree with everything Mami said. I think for me, the political incentives can really act against political leaders investing in managing risks well. If they don't see they're going to get rewarded for it and it's not observable to voters, then they may choose to spend money on something else which is more visible. And then secondly, I think risk management in the public sector is hard. A lot of people misunderstand it. A lot of people think that risk management is about hiring the smartest risk manager and then letting them do their thing. They don't realize that actually it requires quite a particular kind of teamwork with vulnerable people, with senior officials and political leaders, with financial experts, with logistics and delivery experts, and with scientists and people who understand the risk information, all working together in a partnership that for many countries is quite unusual, because line ministries will often work in isolation. You know, you look at the international system and it's structured very much, you know, with little bits doing pieces, but you know, that kind of teamwork, which is important for success, is actually quite difficult to pull off. Where I see hope, though, is I think with this year, the political incentives may be different. So around the world, we have this global shared collective experience of crisis that we can all talk about, and we've all felt, and we've all seen how the system has failed for us personally and our families and friends and countries and the world. And I think people can come together and ask for a better system. So I think the political incentives have changed. And I think the other thing that has changed is we know more now. We particularly know more about the kind of teams you need to put together and the ways that people need to be brought into that process than we did 20 years ago. And I think it is possible, and you know, through you know, the sort of work in the paper that we're here to talk about today, I think this idea of actually the practicalities of getting great teamwork together, and I would say public-private people partnerships are the way forward. I think we know a lot more about how to actually pull it off.
Thank you, Daniel. So it's really about the institutions that can help to drive that as well within governments. So Eric, your perspective in terms of the private sector and how, you know, what is it that you're looking for? You touched on this a little bit in your intervention, but what do you really think can really allow the private sector to lean in a much more significant way?
You know, Ikeswe, I was reflecting. It's good to go third because it gives me a chance to actually think about the question before I have to answer it. I was thinking about the early days of the IDF, right? And some of the challenges that we had to overcome, where around a table, you had groups of people that were lifetime competitors, right? That were looking for advantage and trying to figure out how do we actually join this, but not give away too much, and all the different things that we had to work through together. And it really, the answer comes down to leadership in the end, right? Is you make the commitment to be part of a broader group that is trying to solve bigger problems and not get caught up in the sort of opportunities to take a sliver of it for the gain of one firm over the benefit of all. And so I reflect back on the early days of the IDF, which is why when I think about the report, why it's so special is that you actually had people who were able to put down their individual interests on behalf of the overall industry and what the industry is trying to do with the public sector. And so overcoming the short-termism, thinking about the long-term, thinking about how we're trying to solve issues that frankly are larger than any one organization can solve, and thus far requires the intellectual and financial resources of a larger group as opposed to just one. And then ultimately to maintain the commitment, because this is not going to happen in 12 months. It's going to take years to be able to develop the kind of tools that are needed, understanding the real situation from the public sector that has been in this much longer than the private sector, and what are those lessons that we can bring together so that we can bring that capital to help provide better solutions so that it is not always in a reactionary mode. So there's a lot to the answer. And I do think the IDF is a real example of where it started to where it is today is really about the evolution of how the private sector has to change its mindset in order to be a valuable partner to the public sector.
Thank you, Eric, for that. I think it was a really great insight for many partners who are dialed in on the call. So also the IDF, you know, and the point that was raised earlier is that this is a learning exercise for many parties, right? But there is a willingness to actually say, how do we do this in a constructive manner? And as Daniel alluded to, we have an opportunity. And so the challenge is really, how are the various partners really going to come together to collaborate? And so I have a question for Ian. I'm maybe a little bit taking a bit of advantage of my role as chair for the session. But I have a question for Ian, is that we've heard from Eric, Mami, Daniel on some of the challenges with this, but I wanted to get a little bit more into the details, right? You talk about the need for the paper advocating widespread adoption of open modeling platform standards and principles. But what are the advantages of such an approach? Because I want people to be able to understand what it is that we're asking for and why this is important to allow us to achieve our objectives.
So they're many and broad, actually. So it starts with phrase we use quite a lot, which is lowering the barrier to entry, to accessing quality risk insight. But that's also lowering the barrier to entry for more people to provide quality risk insight. And really, we think the most efficient way of doing that is via an open source ecosystem delivery mechanism, which is accessible to all, to be able to provide that. It's also, we think, the most effective means of being able to enable capability development in region, in country. So allowing governments, municipalities, government agencies to own their own risk by putting in their hands a toolkit that enables them to bring science, data, modeling expertise from within the country that they live, but also from the broader scientific community and the likes of the insurance industry to help construct those models. But they can end up owning that view of risk and owning the models to run that risk and continue to develop the using their own science and engineering and other expertise in country. So back to some of Eric's points, none of that comes this year or next year. This is a long-term sort of multi-year, decadal goal of developing out risk understanding and capability in the places that really need it. And we believe that and the open modeling ecosystem is the best way of doing that. Fundamentally, on the data standards piece of it, this comes back to that language of risk that's come up a few times, which is, so the shared language, the single usage of data standards to build models, to get data to put into models, but then also to be able to talk about models. That shared language of risk and risk understanding is a fundamental underpinning of being able to create scalable, efficient, repeatable delivery solutions across the entire supply chain and all the people in the supply chain. Because if we can't talk about risk the same way, how can we actually get anything done? And when I first started looking at this 5-6 years ago nearly now, that gap of language about risk was vast between the public and the private sector. It's significantly less vast now, but it's still quite big. So beginning to chip away at that would be a big important piece of the goal.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. So I recognize that we only have 10 minutes, so I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience. I have a million questions, but I will stop now. And there are quite a few questions that have come in. This is from Camille Chantinier, and it is for, I believe, Mami. She says, there are frameworks for preparedness, such as forecast-based financing within Red Cross, Red Crescent, and WFP as an example, where national actors are identifying risks and risk management strategies well in advance. Yet there is a funding gap and difficulty to scale up. What are incentives the UNDRR has identified to tackle donor resistance to invest in early action under uncertainty? And I could also ask Daniel for his reflections as well, given your role with an engagement with the donor community on this agenda.
So one thing that is becoming quite clear is that the donors are understanding that the humanitarian demand that is needed after disaster is getting so big that the gap between what is provided and what is needed is getting wider and wider, in spite of countries like UK, Germany, and many others providing a lot of humanitarian aid. So donors are also understanding that investing in disaster risk reduction, prevention is something that they need to do. And even in the humanitarian sphere, as Nick was mentioning, there is much more now anticipatory humanitarian assistance. A lot of countries are saying that this is what we need to do. So I think the mentality is changing more and more, but it's still gradual because it's easier, isn't it, for the taxpayers to understand, okay, that there's a hurricane, hitting a country, people are starving, so we need to give them money. But this is not sustainable anymore. So I think, this is becoming an incentive, but we need to scale this up more. Because currently, if you know, you may know that only 47 cents of $100 of ODA that goes into disaster is for prevention. That is such a small amount of money.
Thank you, Mami. Daniel, for some reflection, and I also like you, I'll also pose another question to you, which is also come in about risk ownership, right? We hear a lot about risk ownership, and it seems central to empowerment, collaboration, and financing. How can we bring risk owners to the forefront, especially in the global South? I think that this is a very important point. So can you also address that?
Thank you, Ekosais. I will certainly try to. So I think on the forecast-based finance and anticipatory action in the humanitarian space, I mean, this is still pretty new. So development actors have been playing in this space for a much longer time than humanitarians have. And I think it's made real rapid progress in the last 5 years from what has been a niche activity to, so early this year, you had a $5 million grant made from the Central Emergency Response Facility for early response, anticipatory response in Bangladesh. And this is a huge step. Previously, donors had to, you could see the cyclone about to hit, Haiyan hitting the Philippines. You had to wait until the cyclone hit before you then said, now let's start thinking about how we can support response. And I think that's a huge shift. And I think it's morally the right thing to do. I think the incentives are there. There are, particularly political leaders are trying out different ways of explaining this. So instead of constantly raiding the aid budget every time there's a cyclone, it's around using, modern science, technology, logistics to actually deliver better, higher impact support. And the onus is on all those involved in actually delivering it to make sure it really does live up to the ambition and the expectations. So I think the story there on the humanitarian side is very positive, although it's just these things take time. On the risk ownership, well, I think the challenge is no one wants to be a risk owner. Everybody would like somebody else to pay. And I think this is why this discussion we're having today about risk information is so important. So if you look at the IMF's, fiscal risk management 101, so they do, the IMF's done a lot of work on banking crises, and banking crises are exactly the kind of crisis that everybody, governments would like to pretend they're not on the hook for, but everybody thinks they are on the hook for. It's an implicit contingent liability. It's not something they're formally on the hook for. And the IMF's 101 basically says, look, if there are these implicit contingent liabilities that no one agrees who's responsible for, at the very least, you need proper surveillance. And we don't really have that proper surveillance at the international level. So we've talked about this systemic risks. We talked about risks facing the most vulnerable people. We don't have that. What we have is we have a system that waits until something happens and then makes a clear articulation of the problem that is there today, not the problem that we may face tomorrow. So I think clarifying risk ownership is really tough. It takes political leadership, but it also takes a bit of transparency and advocacy, and that people need to demand protection, and that you need to have that conversation, and really that process that countries go to away from a culture of relief towards a culture more around protection, where people ask for protection and they get protection, whether it be through private sector, whether it be through public sector, or more likely through a combination of the two. This is the road that we need to go through, but it's messy and complicated.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel, for that. So I have another question, and it's from colleagues all the way in Tokyo, so really late to stay up for this conversation. And the comment is, thank you for the very encouraging messages. And this is to Ian, Nick, but I will also pose it to Eric. In terms of open-ended risk models, do you see increasing number of insurers willing to contribute to your efforts? And are you content with the current level of industry support? And this is really for our industry peers. What are your thoughts?
Do you want to go first, Eric? Or do you want
Sure, Ian. So maybe I'll just say a couple of quick opening comments. I would just say, Ekosway, that it's an area that the industry is realizing, as I was saying before, that no one has enough information to solve the problem individually, and that ultimately the open source model, I think, is the way that the future is going to develop, because it really is about drawing in, it's a modeling problem to draw capital in to help on the solution. And without that type of open source modeling where people can innovate and create off of it and actually draw more capital in to provide the kind of solutions Daniel was just talking about in terms of who owns the risk, in order to provide capital that actually can take ownership of that risk, it needs to understand what the real risk is and how it will work, and how, what return they can expect over time. And right now, the tools that we have aren't broad enough. And so you need to pool the expertise and you need to pool the data. And that really only happens in an open source platform. So I don't think you can solve the problem without it. maybe is a way to answer it. But Ian, I know this is something you feel very passionate about, and let me let you say it better than I did.
So a few thoughts on that. One of which is this innovation thing is really important, because so the insurance industry historically has come at this problem thinking it's got all the solutions, but what do we learn over the last 5 years? Actually, we don't. And so listening to the public sector, really listening to the problem set and really trying to bring solutions specifically tailored to that. We believe that the open modeling ecosystem, the innovation that it will enable both collaboration across public and private sector to provide innovation on the types of models, the types of modeling tools and capabilities that are being used to solve the real problems of the public sector is an important thing about the open modeling ecosystem. I think the question about, do we think enough industry players are coming to that table? Yeah, we're getting there. It's been a long road, but I think we're at a point whereby, I think to some of Eric's points, we're at a point where we're at an inflection point across the industry, but then also across the industry and public sector, of recognizing and having greater visibility on the potential for it to make such a huge difference. So there's still lots of work to be done, but I think there's a very large, strategically focused core group of industry players rallying around this project, I would say. So I'm very confident.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Sorry, I wonder if I could, I'm sorry, I knew you were going to close, but
Yes.
I want to quickly jump in there just to add to this. A noticeable thing that happened while we were developing the paper is just how many of the commercial vendor risk modelers also wanted to join this effort. So not only the brokers and the carriers, but also the commercial modelers. And that was really encouraging, again, a sign of convergence. Thanks, Masaki, for the question. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for that. I recognize that it is 10 o'clock my time, so in Barbados, which means that we're up. But I just wanted to say, I think that what this has clearly shown, this discussion, is that there is a convergence of views. There is a convergence from the development community, the humanitarian community, from people who actually have to deal with these risks on a daily basis to say we want to do more and we want to do better, and also from the private sector. And so within the IDF, this is what we are trying to create. This is what we are trying to drive. Platforms where we can have these discussions, but more importantly, begin to translate them into actual meaningful solutions. If it's the open risk modeling platform, if it is actually driving new kinds of innovative risk financing solutions, that is what we are trying to achieve. And so I want to just say, for those of you, again, who have not reviewed the report, if you haven't, please take the time to do that. There are a series of recommendations in there which I think are quite important. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the Secretariat, myself, Nick, for further information. If you want to engage around this issue, please, because we also want feedback. As was mentioned by, I think, by all the speakers, this is a learning process for all of us. And there are many experts in various quarters, and your perspective actually matters. So I would just like to close by saying thank you very much to Mami, to Eric, to Daniel, Ian, and Nick in particular, who has really been at the center of pulling this all together. And without him, I can definitely say that we wouldn't necessarily be here today. So really thank you to him, and also the lead authors, the 30 institutions that contributed to this, the lead authors who went through the various chapters and reviewed the document, etc., and the people who have actually questioned and challenged us in terms of some of the recommendations. So thank you to all of you. As was mentioned, we see this as a campaign. It's not something that stops now. It's something that the IDF will continue to drive with our partners in the private sector, within the public sector, and with Daniel and others to take this forward, because it is urgent. And so I will just say again, thanks to all of you for making the time to join, and please get involved. That's my only comment. So thanks again to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening and stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Ian. Bye-bye.